Well, all right. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Hot Seat Automotive Podcast. It's your buddy CJ here. And tonight, we're talking about all things automotive industry, the car guy hobby, automotive enthusiast stuff, cars, all the things that real gearheads love talking about. Guys, your buddy CJ, I've had so much going on lately on a personal front. Couple of joyous occasions with the family, some wonderful things happening, some travel. I won't get into it, but I've been busy lately, guys. And I know I haven't posted as much new content, but I'm back. Your buddy CJ's back. With that real gearhead talk. Guys, I am so thrilled to be back in action with you, talking about all the things that real gearheads, petrol heads, car guys just love talking about. Welcome back to all my subscribers. For all those visitors, first timers, welcome. You are welcome here. Give me a like and subscribe. Your buddy CJ will respond to all the comments I can. Guys, let's get right into it. Tonight, we got a very special episode. And tonight's episode goes back, I've been getting a lot of inquiries from folks asking me for my thoughts on cars and different cars. What should they buy? What do I think about their car? What's next for upgrades? All kinds of things. And I love interacting with you guys. Hit me up on Hot Seat Gearheads on Instagram, or here, leave me comments on YouTube. But guys, coming out of those discussions, actually a friend of mine reached out and said, CJ, I'm thinking about getting my first Corvette this year. What do you think I should buy? And the first thing I said was, when we going Corvette shopping? Your buddy CJ's out of control. I'm always thinking about cars, just like you. My next reaction was, that's a really good idea for an episode of Hot Seat Podcast here. Let's talk about, so you want to buy your first Corvette. Tonight's topic is all the things you need to know. I'm going to give it to you straight. Before you buy your first Corvette, gearheads, you got to watch this episode. This is it. I'm going to tell you what your buddy CJ thinks, the things you need to know. I'm also going to give it to you straight in terms of the key purchasing decisions and the key criteria I would look at. A couple things. Certainly, it's going to be largely my opinion. I mean, why wouldn't it be, right? We're here on Hot Seat Automotive Podcast. But having said that, I think candidly, if you ask a straight up Corvette guy, like a lifelong dedicated die on the hill for his Corvette, it's going to be very opinionated about the specific Corvette that he or she wants, right? I'm a car guy. I've always been a car guy. I'll always be a car guy. My allegiance isn't to any one brand per se. I have my favorites, but I continue to rotate. Your buddy CJ continues to rotate through cars. Now, full transparency, I currently have a Corvette. I got a C8 right out there in the garage. I love the darn thing. But I've had a C4. I've had a C7. I've driven countless others. I'm in negotiation. Well, I'm always in negotiations on a car, it seems. But I've been in negotiations for Z06s recently and all kinds of other stuff. I've got two cars on order right now, which I'll disclose at a later time. I've got an Audi, I've got a Lamborghini, I've got the Corvette out here. The only reason that I share that is to let you know that I'm a car guy first, and I like Corvettes, but I'm not obsessed about any one generation or the other. I know them all quite well, some better than others. I've driven pretty much all of them. We'll get to that in a moment. But really what I want to give you tonight is sort of, the independent, objective voice of the lifelong car guy who's owned a bunch of them and driven a bunch of them over the years and has looked at countless, not just Corvettes, but cars in general. I'm going to tell you what I think. And I want to hear from you in the comments what you think, because that's what we do around here. It's real gearhead talk, real automotive enthusiast talk. So we're going to get right into it. Now, what this episode isn't, look, if you've been buying Corvettes for 40 years and you own 6 of them today, and you are a legit hardcore Corvette person, I welcome you to continue watching and to leave me comments. Let me know what you think, agree or disagree. But this episode is not for you per se, okay? I'm glad we're having this interaction, and I want you to stay, and I want you to watch the episode. But in all seriousness, the purpose of tonight's episode is really to be that first-time Corvette buyer's guide. And I'm talking to you. If you're a car guy or car girl, and you've always thought about buying a Corvette, or maybe you're a neophyte to this hobby as an automotive enthusiast and you say, I would like to get into the world of Corvettes, but where do I start? And how do I avoid a pitfall? And what's all this talk about mid-engine versus front engine and C7 versus C6 versus C8, my head spinning, right? We're going to get to all that. We're going to get to all that and more. So let's get right to it. First things first, I want to break it down for you guys. And you know, on this episode, we like to look at these things together, don't we? We always do. We always do as car guys and as automotive enthusiasts on this channel. We look at things together and kind of where did this all begin? So this is a first generation Corvette known as the C1. They made these from 1953 to 1962. Guys, let me be blunt and let me get this out of the way right now. The C1 Corvette is an antique. Okay? So if you are in the market for your first Corvette, this is probably not the Corvette for you. Unless you want to get into the antique automotive hobby and the vintage, classic to antique vintage automotive hobby where you've got a car here that's purely a collector's item. Okay, a C1 Corvette, let's call it what it is. It is a collector's item. Okay, it is from another era. It is from the 1950s. Okay, primarily. This car is going to be driven to car shows, to special events, to parades on weekends. You cannot daily this car, And I guess what I would say is, we'll put this in that category. If you are interested in getting into the antique car hobby, maybe you consider a C1 Corvette. But if you say, CJ, no, listen, I need a car. I need a Corvette that I can drive during the week and put some miles on and not feel bad about it. C1 is not for you. And by the way, the price point on a C1, listen, all day long, you're probably looking at $60,000 to $140,000. That's probably the sweet spot. And guys, prices are all over the map on these C1s. These C1s as antique collector cars, the prices vary wildly. And you're in that antique car market, that vintage car market, where everything matters. Numbers match, restoration, frame off restoration. Is it a survivor? What are the options? All these things. Which year is it? We could do, there are books written on Corvettes, okay? There are Corvette specialists on C1s. You could go out there, find these people, and talk to them. All I'm telling you is this is definitely what I would categorize your buddy CJ, going to give it to you straight. Unless you're interested in getting in the antique car hobby for a parade car or a car show car, stay away. It is not a car you're going to want to drive on a daily basis. And it's super old. Okay? So that's cool for some people, but probably not for my target audience tonight. I'm talking to you, first-time Corvette buyer, someone who wants to get into this hobby. And I claim, stay away from the C1 Corvette unless you want to be an antique automotive enthusiast. So, let's put a pin in the C1 Corvette for the time being. Are we having fun? You better believe we're having fun. So, guys, let's take a look at the next Corvette here. Second generation Corvette. Guys, look at this thing. Absolutely beautiful. The second generation Corvette, also known as the C2, for those who are new to Corvettes, 1963 through 1967. Okay, there are so many options, engine configurations, fuel systems, okay, split window options, okay, body configurations, options, trim packages, engines abound in the C2 Corvette. Again, this is also borderline antique to vintage classic car element of our hobby. The C2 Corvette is also an antique to vintage classic car component of the hobby, right? So unless you said to me, CJ, I want to get a Corvette, number one. Number two, I'm also interested in primarily classic cars to antique cars, the old stuff from that era. I'm going to drive it occasionally. I'm going to take it to parades and car shows. Okay, I'm interested in trading in these super vintage collectible cars, that's when the C2 comes to play. Might there be some cars who don't meet that description? Absolutely. Are there drivers out there? I think that's a bit of a stretch. There are people who probably put more miles on these cars than others. I'd say for the most part, these cars are approaching that same category as the first generation Corvette. These second generation Corvettes, 1963 to 1967, you do the math, okay? We're talking about 60 years ago, folks. These cars are from another era, another time, you know? And they are approaching antique status. They're vintage. You're not going to want to put miles on these cars. Okay. So again, I say the price point for these, not unlike the C1, pricing is all over the map. Trim packages, engines, drivetrains. Is it a split window? What wheels does it have? What year is it? There are so many nuanced differences to these cars, guys. I don't claim to be a C2 expert. What I'm telling you is you got to do your homework. This is when they first introduced the Stingray, for example. But all day long, you could spend $60K to $200K on one of these cars. Real talk. And the devil's in the details. The year, the engine, the options, the color. Is it an original car? Is it a frame-off rotisserie restoration? Or, body, has the car been properly restored? Or was it a hack just to keep it going over all these years? Did it have, is it all numbers matching? All these things come into play with a car like this. You got to be careful. You got to be eyes wide open when buying something like a C2. So again, I'm going to say it right now. C1, C2, I put them in the same bucket, guys. Write it down, take it to the bank. Your buddy CJ said it. Your buddy CJ is telling you. Unless you want to get into the antique car hobby, stay away from the second generation and first generation Corvettes. They are probably not for you. If you're into that life and you're into that scene, you want an antique car, go for it. But if you actually want something you can drive, this may not be the Corvette for you. Guys, let's keep going. All right, guys, third generation Corvette. Guys, third generation Corvette had a long run, 1968 to 1982. To me, aesthetically, looking at this car, I'll be real with you. These cars are absolutely beautiful. They look like Mako sharks. Look at those body lines. It's so classic Corvette. But here's what I'm going to tell you. These cars, coming out of primarily, we're talking late 60s into the 70s, all the way to the early 80s. There is a C3 Corvette for just about every budget. But I will be very blunt tonight and tell you, these cars are not a pleasure to drive. If you're looking to get into the hobby of Corvettes, and you say to me, CJ, I want to be able to drive my car, I want to enjoy it during the week, I want to put 30 miles on it. Sometimes I want to commute to work with it. Other times I might want to go on a road trip. Don't go with a C3 would be my advice. It's not the right car for you. And listen, on the flip side of that, if you love the design, okay, if you love the looks of the car and you love everything about it, and you're going to be a car show person, car meet, parades, weekend cruiser, this could be the right car for you. Don't get me wrong. And I don't hate on the C3. I think it's a cool car from that era. But having driven these cars, this is not something you will want to drive. God knows it's not a daily driver. It's just, there's not much enjoyment in driving one of these from a pure driving experience standpoint. The way they handle, I'm talking about in stock form, right? It's just not great. This platform has not aged well from a performance standpoint. In my opinion, there are better options. And now the good news, okay? What I will tell you about the C3 Corvette is that you can do a little bit better than the C1 and C2. Big surprise, newsflash, the price point, the market kind of validates everything I just said. Those who want the super special collectible antique cars, they might go for a C1 or C2, but these have not endeared themselves with the antique car and the classic car market the way the C1s and C2s have, especially the C2s. But what I'm telling you is for somewhere around 25,000 to 70,000, you can get an absolutely incredible C3, either something that's been restored or a resto mod or a survivor. In that sweet spot of 25K to 70K, if you're all about the C3, have at it. But again, this is a car you got to go in eyes wide open. It doesn't drive the way it looks. Real talk. Your buddy CJ is going to tell it like it is. C3 Corvette does not drive the way it looks. Okay? And if you drive a newer Corvette, which we're going to get to in a moment, you'll be ruined. Or if you've driven any modern sports car and then go back and drive the C3, you're going to feel like you're driving a Chevy pickup truck and not a Chevy Corvette. And guys, if I'm offending anybody, you C3 lovers, sorry, but I got to tell it like it is for the first time Corvette buyer. You know, anything C1, C2, C3, you're talking classic cars, you're talking vintage cars. Some of these cars are now antiques. They don't lend themselves well to putting serious miles on them, to driving them a lot. You will not enjoy driving this car a lot, and the ownership experience won't meet your expectations. So unless, now that we've covered the C1, the C2, and C3, your buddy CJ is going to tell you, unless you want an antique or classic car, stay away from these three. Okay? If you want that hot rod life, that vintage classic, that, you know, American Graffiti era, then go for it. And maybe this is your thing. Okay? But let's move on. Guys, let's move on and let's look at... Okay, guys, things are about to get rad. Can we talk rad for a moment? How about the C4 Corvette? Now, we're talking 80s here, guys. I just got done telling you about the C1, the C2, the C3 Corvette. Now we're into the 80s. Now we're into the rad era. These cars had a run from 1984 to 1996. So if you were to tell me that you want to get into the Corvette hobby, you're a first-time Corvette buyer, maybe you don't have a huge budget, you want something you can drive locally, you know, put some miles on, maybe go to some car shows, maybe run some errands, kind of a weekend cruiser, I would probably start, you know, turning you on to a C4. Reason being, not because these are fabulous drivers, they're not. I've got a whole other episode on the C4. I am a fan of the C4 Corvette overall, from a nostalgia standpoint, and having owned one and having grown up, you know, in a certain era where I was familiar with them. They haven't aged well either from a driving experience, like so many of these other Corvettes. But if you are a fan of the rad era, number one. Number two, if you've got budget constraints, you can have these cars $7,500, $10,000, $20,000, $25,000, all the way up to $40,000 if you really had to have a nice one, a special edition maybe, or super low miles. You can get all the C4 you want. That run from 84 to 96, the ones you want if you're actually going to drive are like 95, 96. 96 was the best year in your buddy CJ's opinion. There are special cars, 90 and beyond, ZR1. Okay, there were anniversary cars. Okay, there was a Grand Sport that's super highly collectible. Go with a later car. Listen, go with what you want and what you can afford, right? All I'm telling you is you get the best of the rad era here if you're into that whole thing. This is an 80s icon. Absolutely. C4 Corvette is an 80s and 90s icon, more so 80s icon because that's when it came out. And these cars just exploded in the 80s in popularity. Okay, they definitely got better. But if you look at the first iteration of the C4 Corvette with that digital dash, come on, that was cool. But then again, the first engines, the first 350s that they put in these, they were not great. The Crossfire engine was not great. The tuned port injection engine was okay. It was a moderate step up. But then that next generation Chevy 350 was much better. That's why I say you want a 95 or a 96. So that's a little bit about the C4. Again, I would tend to say that this is another car that is extremely dated, but it is every bit the Corvette experience. Okay, if I had my druthers between a C3 and a C4, I would go C4 all day long. Even though I do love the looks of the C3 Corvette, C4, I gotta say, would probably be a better driving experience, I would tend to say, especially if you go later in the run, mid to late, mid 90s to 96, when this thing wrapped up. That's the one you want. But the best thing about this car is probably there's a lot of them. Chevy built a lot of these cars. So if you were trying to get into the Corvette hobby on a budget, this would be a good way to do it. Uh, Not a road trip car, I'd say, not a good commuter. It's not a terribly practical car in that regard. It's aging. This is not an era that was known for high quality. So I would say, you're probably going to have some maintenance issues with this car. You're just going to have to maintain things. Any of this old stuff, you will. But this car, I would say for anyone looking to get into the Corvette hobby on a budget, there's a sweet spot here. But again, not a car that you're going to want to daily or take on road trips. In your buddy CJ's opinion. Let's keep going. Let's keep going, guys, because we're having fun tonight, as we always do. All right, guys, let's look at the C5 Corvette. C5 Corvette. This was a big deal when it came out. C5 Corvette had a run from 1997 to 2004. When this thing came out, it had serious innovations, okay? And top to bottom, whether it was the heads-up display or the engine or the aesthetics, the lines of this car, everything. Top to bottom, this was a re-architecture and a redesign for the Corvette, that fifth generation Corvette. These cars I call this the bridge, right? I refer to the C5 Corvette as the bridge from the classic era into the early days of the modern era. How do you like that? Okay, this car was such a departure from everything that came before it. Can't say enough really good about it in terms of what a huge step forward it was from a performance standpoint, from an appearance standpoint, from an interior standpoint, from a technology standpoint. This car was leaps and bounds ahead of the C4, the C3, the C2, the C1. For many of us, this car looked so exotic and sophisticated when it came out. We're talking about 1997, guys. I mean, do the math now, right? We're talking 25 plus years ago, long time ago. Now, the bad news. Couple things. Well, price point. Price point's probably good news, right? I call this a bridge between the classic Corvette era and the modern era. And we'll talk about the modern era in a moment. But these can be had all day long, $15,000 to $40,000. Now, are there special editions, the Z06s, the notchbacks, all those things? Absolutely, that are going to run you on the higher end of that continuum. But I'm telling you, that sweet spot, $15K, $20K, $25K, you can get a beautiful C5 Corvette if that's what you want. Couple things that I don't love about the C5 Corvette. I'm just going to say it. Those pop-up headlights, C5, like the C4, is starting to look like an old Corvette. Like, it's such, we've now had 3 generations past the C5. I'm starting to put it in that bucket. I say it's the bridge between the classic era and the modern era, but it's definitely closer to the classic era. Like, this thing is dated. So it's also not quite at that sweet spot around price point that the C4 is at, where if you look at a C5, yes, it's a quantum leap ahead of the C4, but for what you're getting at that price point, you're almost starting to stretch into C6 money. Now, once we get to the C6 Corvette, we're going to look at in a moment, now we're in the modern era, in my opinion. And there's a lot to like and enjoy with a C6 that you just don't get in a C5. So again, if you're a fan of this design and you love the fact that historically this car was a quantum leap ahead of the C4, have at it. And there are survivors out there that were well maintained, okay, that you can obtain. What I'll tell you is, like, the first time I drove a C5, it was a number of years ago. Your buddy CJ drove a C5 that was all stock. I was underwhelmed. And you know why I was underwhelmed? Because at that point, the car was old at that point, right? And time had passed. And I had driven super fast modern sports cars. So getting in a C5, I mean, it's okay. It's fun, stock, and you can wake them up. I even drove a Z06 bone stock a number of years ago from the C5 era, and I was underwhelmed. I was really underwhelmed. I was kind of disappointed. Now, I didn't push the car to its limits. My point being is that this car's starting to show its age. And depending on your budget, if you could stretch it and you want something that's a bit more modern with better performance, better aesthetics, better styling, in my opinion, jump into a C6 that we're going to look at next. When the C5 came out, this thing was mind-blowing. C5 Corvette was mind-blowing when it came out, but what your buddy CJ is going to tell you is it's starting to show its age, okay? So if you can stretch into a C6, you might want to consider that instead of a C5 as your first Corvette. Let's keep going. Let's keep going because, guys, who's having more fun than us tonight? Nobody. C6 Corvette. Are you kidding me? Many people will refer to the C6 Corvette as the C5.5 because, among other things, this was a bit of a reskin of the C5. What they did was they took that C5 platform, which was a big step up in a complete rebuild and redesign from what the C4 was, a completely different car. They took the C5, which was a quantum leap, and they updated it, okay? And that C6 Corvette came out in 2005, and it ran till 2013. So this is another car that had a pretty good run, okay? And I claim the C6 Corvette, now we have arrived. For all those first-time Corvette buyers out there, you step into a C6. Now you're in the modern era, especially in the later years, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13. You look at the later ones, these cars evolved and got better. You've got something that's practical for daily use. If you were to say to me, CJ, I want a car that I can daily, I commute 12 miles to work, 24 miles to work, whatever it might be, and I want to be able to drive it and maybe go on some road trips with it. Find a nice Survivor C6 unmolested with low mileage on it. There are plenty of them out there. And I claim between $20,000 and $40,000, there are a lot of really great options for C6s. This one happens to be a Z06, so you pay a premium for the Z06s. The only thing I'll say with these, real talk tonight, C6 Corvette, those headlights are starting to show their age. I was never a big fan of these C6 headlights with the clear plastic. Guys, let me know what you think in the comments. I claim C6 headlights, not for me. That's just your buddy CJ. When they came out, I wasn't a huge fan. It's just really starting to show itself as being something from that era. If I think about the Ferrari 360 or other cars that kind of had a similar idea with the headlights, it's dated, okay? So if you look at a C4 or C5 with the pop-up headlights, that's kind of a vibe. That's kind of a thing. And it harkens back to that era with so many other cars. This thing with the clear plastic over the headlights, with the body color underneath, in this whole design with the acrylic or whatever they put over it, Lexan. Not a huge fan. I think it's probably a bit polarizing. But listen, some of you guys out there may love it. All I'm telling you is C6 Corvette, they're out there. This does bring you into the modern era. What I will say is that a lot of these, you got to be careful when buying these because, guys, real talk tonight, the C6 Corvette is now at a price point where a lot of enthusiasts are buying these. They're kind of in that same bracket as kind of Mustang money now and other cars where guys want to get these, mod them, tear them apart, heads, cams, intake, rear end. They're putting superchargers on them, whatever it is. They're building monsters out of these cars, which is fantastic. You do you, fellas. I'm not telling you not to. But as a first-time Corvette buyer, you got to be careful because there's a whole lot of these cars. Your buddy CJ is going to keep it real that have been modded and have had multiple guys wrenching on them over the years. yeah, they sound like a bag of hammers. And you buy one of those cars, you might regret it. Hey, this car I added, it's got 200 additional horsepower and it's got the rear and it's got this and it's got that. And then you go and start running it and she's a leaker. She's leaking fluids and the timing's not right. And it's got a fuel problem. It's got a compression problem. And, you know, the motor runs hot and all these things. Be careful. That's all I'm telling you. I'm not hating on tuned cars and modded cars. I love them. All I'm telling you is if this is your first Corvette and you're looking at C6s, I watch the market closely. Your buddy CJ's always watching the market. And a lot of these have been tweaked and modded heavily, and they're out there. There's also some survivors. If you're a big fan of the C6, and they're great cars, you want to get into one of these in that $20K to $40K price point, look for one that's lower mileage all day long. Doesn't have to be a Z06. The Z06, you're going to pay the higher end of that continuum. You're going to pay a bit of a premium. And, you know, you get that manual transmission, all those things that guys loved with these C6 Z06s. But you can get a nice automatic coupe, okay? You know, and really just enjoy the heck out of it and put some serious miles on it. And a car that's been well maintained. And you can do your road trips and you can do your errands and you can do the car shows and you can join the Corvette Club. C6 could be a really good option for you to get into the hobby as your first Corvette. I would recommend it to anyone. Okay, guys, for many people, the C7 Corvette, for many folks, is the ultimate evolution of that front engine, rear wheel drive, two-door, two-seat American sports car. C7 is it for a lot of automotive enthusiasts. And having owned one and driven a bunch of them, and listen, as a car guy in general, C7 is a fantastic car. And if you told me you've got the budget anywhere from 40K to 80K, depending on what you want, a base Stingray, a Grand Sport, a Z06, options abound. There's a very special ZR1. We won't talk about that. It was a one-year car. But in that sweet spot, there are a lot of great options for low mileage examples of C7 Corvettes. And these cars can be dailied. And they are very well balanced, high performance sports cars in the Stingray trim, in the Grand Sport trim. The Z06 is an absolute performance monster for those that want something supercharged. But what I will tell you is, you know, you won't regret owning a C7 if you can afford it. And let me be blunt. If you're looking at C6s, I would never tell you to get, your buddy CJ would never want you to get over your own head financially. But between a C6 and a C7, there's a lot to love about the C7 over a C6. First of all, the styling brings you right up to date into the modern era. It's not the latest Corvette generation, I know, but for many folks, this is the ultimate evolution of what was the classic Corvette architecture. Engine out front, big long hood, rear wheel drive, two seats, two doors, American sports car. Let's go. Okay. For many folks, this is the one and the only one you want. And I know that. And I will tell you, having owned and driven many of these, you know, if you can afford it, right? C7 could be a really good option for you. And if you're into that, you know, kind of that combination of the vintage styling, that long nose, okay, with that shelf out back, right, and just that sleek design, you know, the C7 might be the right Corvette for you. The styling is very modern. You know, gone are the round taillights, perhaps gone forever on the Corvette. But you know, this really is a super modern looking vehicle, whole new platform. They are fantastic cars to drive. They are super fast. They are quick. You can daily these cars. Again, I would suggest if you really love the C7 design versus the C8, we're going to talk about in a moment. The Grand Sport is probably the sweet spot in the line. You get that just beautiful body package. The suspension could be a bit hard and tight for some folks, but you get a lot of wonderful options and appearance packages, so on and so forth, with the Grand Sport, and you have that same powertrain that's in the Stingray without stepping up into that performance beast that is the Z06 at a higher price point. Stingrays are fantastic as well, guys. Extremely well-balanced cars. You can get them loaded with options in the Stingray, and you'll have it's got plenty of trunk space out back, great for road trips and even for groceries. And then ultimately, as I said, if you wanted to step up to a Z06, this car happens to be a Z06 pictured here. You get sort of the culmination of all of the above. The aggressive styling, the appearance package with that supercharged V8, okay? It's everything you could possibly want out of a two-seat V8 front engine, rear wheel drive American sports car. It really is an incredible car in every way. But guys, let's take a moment here to talk about the C8 Corvette. So here we are, C8 Corvette. Guys, this is the current generation of the Chevrolet Corvette. And Stingrays can be had right now for between $65K all the way up to $120K. Now, you can do better. You can negotiate. What I'm here to tell you is from an MSRP standpoint, from a range standpoint, that $65K to $120K, you can get as much Stingray Corvette as you want. You know, fully loaded up, 3LT, convertible, with all the bells and whistles, okay? These cars have about 500 horsepower in the Stingray trim package. And listen, you've got that rear mid-engine, rear-wheel drive, all-new design, super innovative technology. You know, this car is somewhat polarizing. I think for a lot of the folks who are into the Corvette heritage, they say, well, Corvette's got to have the engine out front, and I need the big, long hood. And, you know, the C7 was the last great Corvette. Setting all that aside, if this is your first Corvette and you can afford to step into that 60, 65K, 70K, 80K price range, these are incredible cars. Your buddy CJ says, as a road trip car, as a daily, okay, as something you're actually going to put miles on, I enjoy driving C8s more than C7s. They're just more balanced, okay? I love the way they shift. These cars have what's known as a dual clutch transmission, okay? These are automatic transmissions. They are lightning fast shifts. They're 8 speeds. The acceleration will melt your face. Now, you can't get a manual transmission in these cars. So let's just get that out of the way. If you need to have a manual transmission, you want something modern, you're going to have to go with a C7 or a C6. But if you're someone who likes to have the current generation of Corvette and your budget is 60K and above, 60 to 100K, let's say, I would strongly recommend you check out the C8 Stingrays. Now, the primary answer is go drive it, right? Go drive a C8 Corvette and see which one you prefer between that and the C7. You know, a lot of people will tell you, well, the C7's better, the C6 is better. Listen, your buddy CJ is going to be blunt with you. Go drive a C8 Corvette, then go drive a C7, go drive a C6, come back and drive the C8. Figure it out for yourself. See which one you prefer. It is subjective. Listen, some folks love the aesthetics and the design and the architecture and the handling of that front engine V8 rear wheel drive platform. Some folks love the high-tech modern presentation that we get from a C8 and that driving experience. It's just different. It still feels, and this is going to sound funny, but I'll be blunt, I'll be real with you because that's how I am. It still feels like a Corvette. This is not a supercar. Don't let anybody tell you it is. It's very different than driving a legit supercar. It is a sports car. It's America's sports car. However, it captures some of those design cues, those architectural elements from traditional supercar technology. They brought that in at a price point, at a value proposition, you know, between 60 and 120K. This is a lot of car for your money. And nobody will argue that. Hell, I own one of these cars. Okay, I love these cars. Z06s, you're probably still looking, unless you can snag one in MSRP. You know, MSRP, you'd be looking at like 110 to 160K. with dealer markups right now, you're still looking at, unfortunately, 130, 140K to 180K, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Dealers are marking them up on the secondary market. Okay. But what I'll tell you is the Z06 first time Corvette buyers, that's a high performance track oriented Corvette. Okay. It's got more aggressive styling. It's got a different V8 engine. Okay. It's got the cross plane crank. It's going to sound a lot more aggressive. It's got different exhaust layout. It's more geared towards the performance enthusiast track, the track type car. It's a bit more harsh than a Stingray. If you're going to be a road trip person, if you're going to be sort of a weekend warrior, going to the car shows, going to the grocery store, doing road trips, going to visit family, you might find the Stingray C8 just better for you. Real talk. Go drive it. Don't take my word for it. Go drive it. See what you think. They also have the E-Ray coming out, okay, which I think they're starting to hit the streets. But again, those cars are going to command a premium, those E-Rays, those hybrid Corvettes, those all-wheel drive hybrid Corvettes. So unless you've got money to burn, probably 170, 180, 200K, now you're into that price point with a lot of incredible cars. I don't think this is the right time to buy a Z06 or an E-Ray as your first Corvette. Real talk. I'll tell you like it is. Your buddy CJ's been in negotiations on several of these cars. I pulled out. I may still snag one, don't get me wrong, but I just don't think this is the right time for you or for me to buy one of those for a bunch of different market reasons. And I think there will be an adjustment. Listen, if they can command that market premium, you know what your buddy CJ says? Let them. Let the cars sit. A lot of these cars are sitting on the dealership lots, the Z06s, the E-Rays. We'll see what happens. But I claim it's going to continue to adjust. So right now, if this is your first Corvette and you're looking at the C8, I would probably strongly recommend that you consider a Stingray. Go drive it. Z51 package will give you a little more oomph and a little bit more aggressive styling. All kinds of cool options out there for you guys. But, we've covered a lot of ground tonight talking about Corvettes, but specifically, if you're a first-time Corvette buyer, which one should you consider? And so sort of from the bottom of my heart, when I talk to people about these things, first things first, the first question I would ask after covering all this ground with the generations and kind of giving you the overview, what do you want to use the car for? I'll come back to where I started. Do you want to go to classic car shows? Do you want to go to Cars and Coffee? Do you want to do road trips? Do you want to use this vehicle as a daily, as a supplement to your daily? Do you want to use it to go visit friends and family 300 miles away? Do you want to use it as your beach or mountain getaway car? I'm going to ask you those questions first. And as you answer those questions, it's going to start positioning you towards one generation Corvette or maybe a couple different generations of Corvette versus the others. Again, I'm going to reiterate, if you want to get into the antique car hobby, you're probably looking C1, C2, C3. These cars are old. We're talking 60, 50, 40 years old, okay? These cars are aged. They're aging. It's not something that you're going to want to put big miles on, okay? There's a lot to consider when buying a car that old. There's a whole lot of attributes. You got to kind of go in eyes wide open when buying that vintage Corvette. Are you the type of person who wants to jump into that aspect of the hobby? Or do you want something from the modern era? It sits in your garage till you get in, turn the key, and go. Change the oil once a year, check the fluids, and it's ready to put 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 miles a year, 8,000 miles a year. Go do it. If that's the car you want, then I'm going to say at a minimum, go with a C6. Now, there's budget considerations. What's your budget? If you're on that cusp, I'd say somewhere around 40K-ish. I would say get into the C7 if you can, if you like that more modern look. Or if you say, CJ, that's kind of stretching it for me, but I want to have modern, go with a C6, maybe a 2011, 12, 13. Low mileage. You can get a lot of C6 for that same money. I use that as an example. But guys, the good news about our hobby, and specifically the Corvette hobby, any one of these cars will bring you joy and put a smile on your face. It kind of comes down to number one, what you want to use it for and what aspect of the hobby you really want to get into. Number two, what's your budget? And I would never, never want to see a friend or one of my buddies out there, one of my subscribers, new friends, would never want to see you get in over your head, which is why I say maybe a C4 Corvette at this phase of life, depending on where you're at, 7,500, 10,000 bucks, 15,000 bucks. You can snag a C4 Corvette and be the weekend warrior, going to car shows, going to car meets, joining the car clubs with your really cool C4 Corvette with the pop-up headlights and the hood that opens up and everybody comes and checks out your engine. You're in, baby. So there is a Corvette for everyone. And, guys, I really want to hear from you. Are you a Corvette guy? What do you think about my analysis here? If you're new to the hobby, you're thinking about buying your Corvette, you got to watch your buddy CJ's video, and I'm glad you did. Come on. But here's the issue. Here's my ask. You got to leave me comments and tell me what you're looking at. Are you snagging a car? Do you agree? Hit me up. Leave those comments. I'll respond to all the comments I can. Guys, those are just a few thoughts, what I think every new first-time Corvette buyer should know before getting into the market. Those are some of your buddy CJ's suggestions. But guys, I love you. You're so important to me. We're having such a blast on this channel. Let me know what you think. Give me a like and subscribe. Leave me those comments. And guys, listen, I just can't wait to speak to you on the next one. Till then, peace.